Welcome back, girls. What a fabulous week it's been. I've loved seeing all of your gorgeous quilts coming through. Lots of really beautiful variations and also different and individual. It's been lots of fun to watch. So the video tutorial for this week, though it is a few days late, I've just had a couple of issues with the app I use, and a few of the videos that I originally filmed decided not to work properly. But that's, the technical gods looking down on me and laughing. But that's fine. We're all over that. Hopefully this one will be good to go. So I'm going to do a binding tutorial for you. Just to show you a couple of different methods that I use to attach my binding to quilts. So the first method I'm going to use is cutting my binding strips to 2.5 inches wide, and how you work out the amount of binding that you need to go all the way around your quilt. So measure 2 of your sides, so top and down the side of your quilt, times that by 2, and then add 20 inches. For that. So whatever that number is the required amount of inches that you need to get around your quilt. And how to work out how many strips to cut. I usually work out that you're going to get roughly 40 inches from a strip of fabric. Sometimes they're a little bit longer, but that's okay. A little bit more is better than not enough. So you divide that number by 40 inches, and then that will give you the required amount of strips. So the 20 inches just allows for going around the corners and a little bit extra. I'm always really generous with my binding, and whatever my calculations tell me to cut, I always cut an extra strip anyway. It just saves that anxiety of getting all the way around to the end and you're 2 or 3 inches short from the end. And your binding leftover strips can always be used for your labels, like I showed you in the label tutorial, or you can join them all together to make a scrappy binding for a scrappy quilt. So they never go to waste. So cutting that extra strip really isn't relevant, unless of course you are on the bare minimum of the amount of fabric that you have that you're going to use your binding strips for. Okay, so that's the first method, cutting them at 2.5 inches, and that method I'm going to show you is a traditional binding method where you're machine stitching your binding onto the front of your quilt, then you're turning it to the back and hand stitching that in place. I'm not going to show you how to do the hand stitching, I'm just showing you how to do the machine part of that. The second way I'm going to show you to add a binding, I cut my binding strips at 3.25 inches, so they're quite a bit wider. So 3.25 inches is the width that I cut them, and you're going to work out the length exactly the same as what you do for the other binding method. And with this method, what I do is I stitch my binding to the back of the quilt, and I turn it over to the front, and then I machine stitch the front of it. So I machine stitch it to the back of the quilt, then I flip it over to the front, and then I machine stitch it to the front of the quilt, and I use a particular method for that, which I'll show you when we get to that. So once you have your required binding strips ready to go, we're then ready to join all of these together. So I'm going to head over to the sewing machine and show you how I join all my strips together. So once you've got all your binding strips cut, your required amount, you then want to sew them all together so they're all in one length. Now I like to sew my binding strips on a 45-degree angle rather than on a straight angle. I just think it distributes the bulk a little bit better, and it's less noticeable around your quilt with that angled seam allowance. So the easiest way I have found, and if you have a way that suits you better, then that's fine, but I find this always works well. What I do is I come in from the side of my machine with my first strip, and you want this to be right sides facing upwards. Now this is a solid, so it's a little hard to tell the difference, but it'll be right side facing up. I then bring in my next strip that I want to join in from the back, so in underneath, and I cross that over. So you're now going to do right sides together. So this will be the wrong side here on this top strip, and you'll have your right sides together. So I bring it in, and I haven't cut off my selvages here. I usually just leave them, and I deal with those after. But what I do is I bring it in and I come across at least a ½ inch from the edge of that strip, and you want to make sure that it's at right angles with your strip underneath, and once again around ½ inch, depending on how large your selvage is and where those little dots are. So you want to make sure that the edge of your strip is past that edge of the selvage, so it will be removed when you chop it off. So you can see here you've got this mark where we want to stitch across. Now if you want to draw that line on, that's fine, you can, or I just eyeball it normally. Or the other option with our tape method, if you've still got your tape here with your center seam, I've actually removed mine at the moment, you can use that as your guide. So what you want to be doing is stitching from this little point here right through to this little point here. So if you've got that tape for our triangles still on your machine, then this works perfectly for that as well. So I lower my needle, just raise my foot and take that little center point right up to the edge of the needle, and then I sew straight down through, and you're going to come directly through that little gap through there. So at this stage I don't cut them, depending on how many strips of course that you have to join. I then grab that strip, that top strip, and I slide it along my hand because you don't want it to get twisted, and then I bring the end of that piece in from the side edge. So once again this will be right sides up, and you're coming in from the left hand side into your machine. You then grab your next strip and bring that one in from the back, line that up again, so keeping that square, going into that point, and stitching straight through till it comes out through that little space again. So then you keep on joining until you have all your required strips together. I've just got one more to go, so I might as well join that. So once again, grabbing that top strip, bringing it in from the left hand side, so right side's facing up. Your next joining strip, bringing in from the back, crossing that over, and then you're just going to turn it on 45-degree angle, line up that gap down that side, and stitch straight down through that next point. Okay, so all your strips will be chain pieced together, so just cut them apart. Okay, and if you open that strip up now, you can see that that's joined perfectly down through at a 45-degree angle. So we're now going to go and press these, and I'll show you how I like to press my binding strips. So you now want to press your binding strips in half. So these ones are cut at 2.5 inches. So you want to just trim that excess back to 1/4 inch. You can do it with your rotary cutter or with scissors. It's up to you. And it doesn't have to be absolutely accurate, as long as you have at least that 1/4 inch seam allowance there. Okay, so that's my strips trimmed. So the first thing I like to do is press open my seams. So you want these seams to be pressed open. So if you press all of those. Okay, so once you've got those seams pressed, just make sure that there's no pleat through the back there. Okay, so you now want to press your binding strips in half. You're going to have the wrong sides facing up and making sure that you have got your seams in the right spot. It doesn't matter so much if it's obvious, your right and wrong side, but if like me and I have a solid, you want to make sure that these seams are the way that you are pressing the wrong sides together. So lining up those raw edges and giving them a press all the way down the strip. Using steam is good, that will help get a really nice crisp edge. And you want to do that with your whole binding strip. So once you have your whole binding strip ironed, I then want to come to my first end. So the end that you're going to start with. So it will be the end. So if you imagine this is the edge you're going to lay on the edge of your quilt, on the top of your quilt, along with the edge of it. So you're going to just open that up and fold that across so that you get 145-degree edge, and just give that a press. Okay, so make sure that's nice and square, and then fold that back again and give that another press. Okay, so you can see you've got this 45-degree line pressed, and then when you've pressed that back, you've got this edge which is already turned, and this will be the beginning of your binding strip. So we're now ready to sew this onto our quilt. So you're now ready to sew your binding onto your quilt. Now, with trimming a quilt before you place the binding, there are a couple of different ways you can do this, depending on what you have on the edge of your quilt. So if you have a quilt that is pieced, you're going to have piecing right up to the edge of your quilt, so you don't want to be chopping off some of those points. So you will probably find that it is really difficult to square up a quilt with a pieced edge. So you just want to hope that your piecing has been really accurate and that your quilt is nice and square to begin with, because you're basically usually just allowed that 1/4 inch seam around the edge of your quilt to place your binding on. Now I always like to have your 1/4 inch line, so this is the edge of your quilt, for example, where my blue line is here, and then I always have an extra 1/4 inch past that line. So for example, this is where you're going to be stitching the binding. Your binding is going to be going level with the edge of your quilt, and you're going to stitch in a 1/4 inch from there, and then you're going to have that extra 1/4 inch excess on the edge. Now with a piece quilt, what I tend to do is not trim off the excess of my batting and backing before I've stitched my binding on. I usually stitch my binding on first, and then I use that stitch line to then trim back my quilt so that I get that 1/2 inch. It just keeps things a little bit more stable. But if you're able to trim up and square up your quilt, for example, if you have a quilt that's got a nice large border on it, you can square all that up first. I use a large square ruler in my corners and then another long one next to that to then continue squaring up that quilt. If like this one and it's just a sample and some of the edges are a little bit dodgy and not quite perfect, what I'll do is I'll draw a line where I want the edge of my binding to be. So in some of my designs here, I've drawn in a line where my stitching line has, so that's going to be my actual sewing line. So I've then got a 1/2 inch past that. So once again, that little line on the edge of my quilt, and then I'm lining up my binding level with that line, and then once I've done my 1/4 inch seam, that gives me that 1/2 inch. So when you then turn that binding over, you've got a nice, really full binding. So it's really important to have a full binding on the edge. You don't want a binding that has no filling on it right on the edge, because it will wear much quicker than a binding that's got a nice full stuffing in the middle of it. Okay, so I'm ready to stitch the binding onto this one, so we'll head over to the sewing machine. We're now ready to sew our binding on to the front of our quilt. The binding strip needs to line up either with the edge of your quilt or with the drawn line that we have on this particular quilt. So representing the edge of our quilt, just to keep things nice and straight. I usually start back from a corner, so this is the corner of, or the edge of our quilt, and depending on the size of it, but I never start close to the corner because we want room to maneuver once we come back around the other side to be able to join those binding strips easily. So I'm just starting back from one of the squares, and you then don't want to start sewing right where our little 45-degree turn is. I usually allow about 10 inches from there. So 8 to 10 inches from the beginning of your binding strip. So just lay that on and then move that across, and I'm lining up my binding here with the lines on my quilt. And your foot that you're using, your needle position, is in a 1/4 inch needle position. So it's going to be a 1/4 inch from the edge of your foot, whether you move your needle position across or you have your 1/4 inch foot on there. So once everything's lined up, you're going to begin. I don't usually bother with a little locking stitch at the beginning. We need to come back over that when we stitch the strips together around the other side. So stitching down the side of your quilt, keeping the edge of your foot level with the edge of your binding, and then the binding is going to be level with the edge of your quilt or the line that you have drawn on there to represent the edge of your quilt. So as you're coming up to the corner, you want to be stopping a 1/4 inch back from your sewing line. So here you can see I have marked in a little mark. So that's a 1/4 inch back, and that's where you want your needle position to stop. So I usually mark it on this quilt and then lay my binding down once I get there. So I just pre-draw that beforehand. Now I'm using a texture here. I wouldn't normally use that. It's a Crayola texture, but it's just going to be visible for you to see. So then put a mark across your binding so that you can see your stopping line. And stitch down until you reach that line. Okay. You're then going to pivot your quilt this way, and you're going to stitch straight off the edge. Okay, so completely off the edge of your quilt. I then just cut my thread. I find that's easier. So you can see here I've got this little right angled stitching line. So up to that point where your line was, and then you've stitched straight across. You're then going to pivot your quilt around again. So your quilt is positioned that you're going to be coming down the next side. grab your binding strip and you're going to fold that back like that, and the edge of your binding should now be running level with the edge of your quilt or the line on your quilt. Pull that back until it reaches that stitching point that you've just done. Finger press that fold. Right, finger press that fold. I'll just come back a little so you can see. And you're then going to fold that binding back onto itself until that fold is level with your binding strip there. So lining up that line again, or the edge of your quilt, and you're going to stitch across that fold, and I do a little back stitch there at that fold as well. So then continuing to stitch your binding on the next side of your quilt. I'll continue down until I get to the next corner. So I'm coming up to the next corner, and once again I've marked in that line, so that stopping line on the quilt, and keep stitching until you hit that line. Pivot your quilt around this way and then stitch across. You can keep your thread attached if you want to rather than cutting. I just find it's easier to pivot back. Okay, so you're going to fold that binding back again, give you that 45-degree angle, and then fold that binding back onto itself until that fold is level with the edge of that binding, and your binding is now level with your edge of the quilt along that side. Starting again, little back stitch, and then continue stitching all the way around your quilt until we get back to the other side. Now made my way all the way around to the quilt, and I'm almost at the end here where we began. So I want to again leave a reasonable distance from this strip to our little 45-degree line here, so that we've got enough room to maneuver. So I'm going to finish that off there. Once again, you don't need to do a little locking stitch. So you can see here I've got a bit of a space there, and it will then run up. So we'll head it back over to the ironing board, and I'll show you how I then join those strips together. Okay, we're ready to join these two together. Now there are lots of variations on how to join these two strips together. There's lots of weird twisty ways you can do it. This is the easiest way I have come up with to join these two accurately, so that you get a nice 45-degree angle when you're joining that. So you want to trim your binding down till it's just a couple of inches past this. Maybe 1.5 inches is probably enough, just so that it is past this edge here. So when you tuck that in there like that, okay, you've got enough. It's not going to be too close to the edge of that. Okay, and I like to press everything so it's nice and flat. So just pressing that piece first, then bringing this bit up, just making sure that your 45-degree angle there is nice and flat again. You're then lining that up with the edge of your strip. Okay, so that looks nice and even, and you can see that's sitting nice and flat. Okay, so then what I do is I grab some Roxanne's basting glue, or a basting glue of some sort. Roxanne's is probably your most common one around at the moment. and open up your strip with your 45-degree line. You're going to run a thin bead of glue along that folded edge. Okay, you can see that. You're then going to grab this piece here and you're going to tuck it inside so that it sits nice and flat, level with your line. Just making sure that all those raw edges are level and that this folded edge is nice and flat in there. Okay, use your iron to heat set that glue. So add quite a bit of heat to that so that that glue dries. You can lift that and turn that over just so that you can hit the heat to the back of that as well. Okay, so your two pieces are now joined together, but what you want to do is open up that seam. So lifting from this end, this seam, and you'll find it may be a little stuck. Okay, so you're going to open up that seam so it continues through. You're then going to lift this extra piece, this extra tail, and ease that open. So you can see here now you have this fold that you've created with your iron from that first stitch, that first time we folded, and this is where we want to stitch. So we're then going to take it over to the sewing machine and stitch exactly on that folded line. So you'll just need to lift your quilt and fold it back, but you can see you've got that lovely fold line in your fabric. If you've got a really heavy quilt, like a really big quilt that you're working on, I tend to put a couple of pins in here just to hold it there, because if you tug on it, it will come apart. It's only very easy washable basting glue, but this is only a light one, so I'm not going to, just so that by the time you get it over to the sewing machine, you haven't pulled apart that stitch. So I'm just going to head over and sew that. So you can see I've sewn across that fold line now, and basically our strips are joined together. So if you then open that up, that sits nice and flat and it fits perfectly. But what you want to do is get rid of this seam allowance first, and you also want to press that seam open. Now you want to, before you trim this seam allowance, just gently pull, because that is glued together, those two edges. And it's much easier to do it at this stage than it is to do it after you've trimmed, because if you've only got a little 1/4 inch, it's really difficult to pull that open, and you'll have to press your seam to the side. So if you pull that open first, because you've got a nice chunk to hang on to, it makes it much easier. Then you can trim off that excess back to your 1/4 inch. Finger press that seam, press it with the iron. Okay, then going to fold that out, give that a press, and as you can see, that fits perfectly along the edge of my quilt, and you're then going to finish stitching the rest of that binding line together. You now have your binding completely stitched on to the front of your quilt. Okay, just trim any excess pieces. So what I like to do now is press that flat all the way around your quilt. Give that corner a nice press. Okay, so that's done. You're then going to open your binding up. Okay, so I like to just finger press that open first, or hand press that open first, and I then press that open with the iron. Okay, so you're making sure there's no pleats there. And with your corner, okay, so you'll then have this corner edge. Now with the corner it can tend to be a little bit bulky because you've left that extra to make your binding nice and full, but in the corner it does add a little bit more bulk than you actually need. So what I tend to do is trim across that corner, just trim off that little triangle. And just finger press that open and then press that little 45° in the corner, and you can actually then deal with this extra one at the back. Okay, so all the way around your quilt, pressing that binding nice and flat into that corner, trimming off that little extra across that corner, pressing that open. So you're only trimming back to that little excess at the corner. You're not trimming all of it off. You're not trimming right back to your stitching line. You're still trimming so that that corner is still full, but it just makes that corner sit a little nicer. Okay, so work your way around until you've completed your whole quilt. You're then ready to hand stitch that. Okay, so you're then going to turn that over and you will then hand stitch the edge of that just past that stitching line. Okay, so depending if you like to use pins or the little clover clips, that's what I tend to prefer. The little, have some here, should have been prepared earlier. Okay, so just turn that back, clip them in place, however many you have. If you've got a nice big packet, that's very handy. You can go all the way around with those little clips, but I find they're fantastic for holding your binding back. One of their very many great uses for those little clips. And then when you get to the corner, you're just going to ease that in, create that nice little mitre. I'll just redo that because I think I was out of camera shot. Okay. Easing that. You can always give that a little press too if you like as you are. Okay, so you get that nice little corner and you've got this lovely little corner on the front for your binding. So you're then going to just slip stitch that into place with whatever method you like to stitch your binding on. An invisible applique stitch, hem stitch, whatever is least noticeable for you. And I tend to, if I'm doing just a regular quilt, so just an everyday quilt, I'll do my stitches between 1/8 and 1/4 inch apart. On my show quilts, they're actually much closer, so I actually do them about 1/16 of an inch apart, so there's actually no space whatsoever. But that takes much longer, and I find with just general day-to-day quilts, it's not necessary for that extra time to be spent. Holds it together well. Okay, so that's the first method of binding that I'm going to show you, and then we'll head over and I'll show you the second one.